Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're still in the process of letting people in. I'm Jeff Pasley, the professor of history here at the University of Missouri and associate director of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. And this is our weekly colloquium that we have almost every Friday during the semester. And today is one of it, part two of a two-part series where we're addressing not just the Missouri bicentennial, but much more specifically the bicentennial of the Missouri crisis that Missouri statehood caused. Something that's always has actually long been probably a bigger concern to historians of the early republic than it is to people in Missouri. In fact, I know that's the case. But then we're lucky today to welcome here this afternoon. This afternoon. It's our afternoon, but he's coming from across the ocean and deep in the night. Dr. Donald Ratcliffe, the senior research fellow at the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford, and emeritus reader in history at Durham University, where he taught for many years. We'd planned for Don to attend our Missouri Crisis conference that we had 2 years ago on the literal bicentennial, the Talmadge Amendment, but he, for various reasons, couldn't be there. And we were just discussing the fact that it was such a bad weather day that if he'd come that day, he would have been here for 2 weeks. And then we rescheduled it to the planned overseas British American 19th century historians conference that we're going to have here. That's been canceled officially once, but really twice due to COVID, I believe. So we decided we just can't wait anymore, partly because the book that Don's contributing to would actually beat him here if we didn't actually do this. So we're glad to have Don actually get to speak to us today. One could go into personal stories about Don Ratcliffe. He was reminding me of some yesterday, though one of them that wasn't very flattering to me, involving falling asleep during one of my papers. But my students have done that too. It seems more important to brag to our local audience and students that the man we're hearing from today is quite simply one of the greatest living political historians of early America that we have, and one of the most respected on both sides of the Atlantic. And I mean an old school, down in the weeds researcher type of historian, not the kind who goes on TV or appears at auditoriums to measure the character of this or that founding father. Don is the real deal, as our friend Jay would say. Historian's historian. Part of Don Ratcliffe's greatness is that in his modest, witty, gentlemanly way, a way that leads him to also be a historian of his local brewery, as well as historian of the early American Republic. He's a real iconoclast, someone who's been carving out his own intellectual path ahead of the trends or against them for 50 years. He was writing anti-slavery politics before that was cool, before most historians actually even believed in that. Historians of the early Republic, that is, didn't believe that it existed, in other words. And pursued a completely different view of early American politics from the Jacksonian democracy thesis that rose and fell so many times. Now it's kind of sunk to the pit of hell. But it used to be very big. Don was never on board with that, though. He had a different. Call from landlines. Excuse me. I was just getting good there. One of the things we discovered, in fact, in the process of doing this conference and book, was that in going back over the old historiography, that turns out that Don Ratcliffe is actually one of the first historians to, in a big venue, to actually use the term Missouri crisis instead of plain old Missouri Compromise or Missouri question or something like that. Seeing this for something as important as we think it is. On top of the many outstanding articles and book chapters that are some of that Don's written, they're some of the best you'll ever read. Don has three main books, his two definitive tomes on Ohio politics. I've only got one of them here. Party Spirit in a Frontier Republic, Democratic Politics in Ohio. That was all then the second volume of that was The Politics of Long Division, the birth of the second party system in Ohio. And more recently, another definitive work, this time a very different take than what you might be used to, on the presidential election of 1824. And that's the one-party presidential contest, Adams-Jackson in 1824's five-horse race. Most Americans, and probably, we do try to teach Don's version. When at least I try to teach Don's version when I get the chance, but unfortunately, most Americans probably still remember that as the corrupt bargain election, the beginning of the very first Stop the Steal movement. Don explains that that's really not the way we ought to be thinking about that election, and I think we'll hear some of those ideas today. Don's book received high praise from all kinds of people. It also received two prizes: the British Political Studies Association's Neustadt Prize and the Lasky Prize in Political History, the very first one of those that was given from Lebanon Valley College. But before I forget, Don's book, the University of Kansas Press has generously offered a discount to anyone who wants to buy Don's book who's attending this meeting. Allison's going to send their discount flyer, or at least the code, through on the chat, and you can also use it. There's another one you can use for actually every book in that series that the 1824 book is part of. And some of you may know there's another book in that series that's very dear to my heart. So please buy as many of those as you want. But enough intro. But there's just so many things to say about Don. You have to go on a while. But enough intro. What Don is presenting today, as I said, would have been the contribution to the Missouri Crisis Conference we mentioned at the top, where we actually served dough faces that you could eat. It also draws from his contribution he's making to the bicentennial book that Craig Hammond and I are about to publish with the University of Missouri Press that originated that conference. Don's essay is going to be one of the marquee efforts in volume 1 of that. It's a 2-volume set, and I'm going to just briefly put the covers up there. So the first one, the one on the left, the blue one will be the Don's essays in volume 1 will be available later this spring. And I am totally convinced that the second one is really, really, really going to come out during the bicentennial year. But don't. I'm not betting. I'm not going to bet any money on a large amount of money, though the press would probably hate to hear me say that. But let me turn, without further ado, that's a lot of ado, but let me turn it over to Don Ratcliffe for today's presentation.
Well, that's very kind of you, Jeff. Such an over-the-top introduction. You missed out. You missed out the key thing about my falling asleep during your talk. I was the chairman. That, of course, is simply an invitation for him to get his retaliation in this evening. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I would like to say it's nice to see you, except I can't. Some things in American history, it seems to me, become so familiar to us that everyone takes them for granted. And the Missouri Compromise is a prime example of that. In my essay for the bicentennial anthology that Jeff has mentioned, I try to give a fuller and more complex picture of the making of the compromise that is usually found. In the process, I expose a few flaws and lacunae in the standard story. And in this talk, I'm going to pick on what I think of as the two headline myths, which I think, above all, pervert our understanding of the compromise and its significance. The first myth is the belief that the compromise was built around the principle of sectional balance that the Union was supposedly built on. The principle that there should be an equal number of slave and free states, which meant in 1820 that the admission of Maine as a state had to be balanced by a slave state, and the appropriate one was Missouri. I used to accept this until I looked closely at what actually happened in Congress in 1820. And I found this interpretation so directly contrary to the truth of what happened that I can scarce understand how the myth was ever created or how it can have remained uncontested for just so long. The second myth arises from the fact that the House of Representatives was dominated by Northern free states and the Senate by Southern slave interests. Given that the South saw the unrestricted admission of Missouri as a matter of life and death for slavery, a compromise could only be achieved if enough Northern congressmen decided to vote with the South and admit Missouri as a slave state. Those who did so were caricatured as dough-faces who had caved in before Southern threats, and modern historians commonly see them acquiescing in the establishment of a pro-slavery dominance in Washington that lasted right down to the Civil War. Well, I agree on the pro-slavery dominance during the Jacksonian and antebellum eras, but I do not believe that the Missouri Compromise established it. On the contrary, a strong case can be made for seeing the compromise as an anti-slavery triumph, and that's its huge significance. But to find out what I mean by that, you're going to have to be patient and wait for me to get there. So let's first of all look at the main complication. I realize, as always, I have started without noting the time at which I started. How long have I been speaking for?
3 minutes.
Huh?
3 minutes. You're good.
I'm good. Okay. I get very obsessed with the whole thing about time. Right. Well, as you probably know, the District of Maine had long been an integral part of Massachusetts and gained representation in Washington as part of the Massachusetts congressional delegation. In 1819, a referendum in the district voted for statehood, and the Massachusetts legislature agreed to support the move as long as Congress approved it by March the 4th, 1820, an important deadline. Even before the issue was presented in Congress, some leading Southerners saw how they could exploit it. Simply announced that the Senate would only accept Maine as a state on condition that the House voted to admit Missouri without any restriction on slavery. This was the maneuver which supposedly persuaded a critical number of congressmen, especially those from Maine itself, to vote for a slave Missouri. Traditionally, historians have assumed that this proposal fulfilled Congress's settled policy with new states, that they should be admitted in pairs, north and south, so as not to disturb the sectional balance. This interpretation is described in a rather confusing illustration. Oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. Pardon me. That's what was supposed to happen. That wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, guys, there we are. Okay. This is the general sketch that Meinig lays out in his interesting, I think fascinating book, The Shaping of America, a historical geography. Now, if you just look at the left-hand column, the admission of new states in the 30 years before the Missouri crisis, and you note that the paired admissions are in bold letters, you can see it doesn't exactly establish a case. It is thought that there was some jockeying in the early 1790s to admit Vermont and Kentucky together, but there was little discussion of the principle of balance. And actually, the two states were admitted by two separate bills passed in different sessions. One reason, if we actually translate that into a slightly easier to understand, more chronological order, you can see the point that in the first 16 states to enter by 1796, in no way were balanced between slave and free. What created the balance was the decision of New York and New Jersey to pass gradual emancipation acts in 1799 and 1804. By the time New Jersey acted, the state of Ohio had been admitted, largely by Southern votes, and that created a free state advantage. Nobody bothered. There was no real attempt to put the balance right. And when Louisiana came in, it did so because of the international crisis, which made the federal government think it was necessary to satisfy Louisiana's interests in order to ensure its loyalty in a time of coming war. So by the time of the War of 1812, there's very little evidence of an attempt at balance. After the war, it looks a little different. Indiana and Mississippi come in more or less together, roughly paired, little discussion of balance, and admitted by two separate bills passed in separate sessions. Now, one reason why there was so little anxiety about balance was the fact that the slave interest always gained some support in the North. And this was made absolutely clear with the admission of Illinois, where slavery was banned under the Northwest Ordinance. But the dominant political interests were Virginian and eager to admit slavery there once Illinois was established as a state. Its admission in 1818 nominally created an extra free state, but in fact its political outlook meant that it strengthened the southern side. And when Alabama was admitted in 1819, that wasn't a balancing measure, but one which in practice gave the slave interest a 12-10 advantage. Note that Alabama was admitted in December 1819. After the initial argument over Missouri's application and the Talmadge Amendment and the organization of Arkansas in February of 1819. But Alabama was considered on its own merits in December without any thought for its impact on the simmering Missouri question. This reflected the long-standing assumption, widely accepted in the North, that the existence of slavery in the South was the fault of the British, true enough, and that the South therefore had special needs that the rest of the nation had a duty to recognize. Moreover, this moral obligation applied not only to the original states of 1776, but to their colonial offshoots in the New West, east of the Mississippi. Even the leaders of the anti-slavery interest believed that Congress should take no action that might provoke a slave rebellion in a frontier area close to settled slave states. And they accepted Alabama's admission, even though it shifted the congressional arithmetic further against the anti-slavery cause. The point I'm making is that there was no settled policy or tradition of balance. Each application had been treated on its merits, and certainly before 1820, two applications had never been wrapped into one bill. The absence of any commitment to the notion of sectional balance shows just how far the sections were from possessing a clear-cut sectional identity before 1820. So when a month later, the Senate proposed wrapping the admission of Maine and Missouri together in one bill, it was regarded not as obedience to a long-standing traditional formula, but as an unprecedented attempt to bully the House into surrendering to the Senate's dictation. As a consequence, the proposal sparked a rebellion in the House of Representatives. The House absolutely refused to consider the rest of the Senate's compromise package, including the bits of it that were intended to appease the North. So incensed was the lower house that many members who'd previously shown sympathy for the Southern cause, including some Northerners and many from border states, refused to consider any part of the compromise proposal as long as Maine and Missouri were wrapped together. As a result, the South's persistence with the suggestion simply aggravated sectional hostility and made compromise more difficult. Even Maine's representatives in the Massachusetts delegation opposed the Southern maneuver. On February the 22nd, the Maine members issued a formal appeal to Congress, signed by them all, including well-known doughfaces like John Holmes, insisting that its admission was absolutely urgent, but only when the Senate proposal had been withdrawn. Maine must not buy its statehood at the price of admitting a new slave state into the Union. And so they would persist. In the final votes on the compromise on March the 2nd, 5 of the 7 Massachusetts congressmen who represented Maine districts voted against a slave Missouri, although that would risk leaving Maine's future in the hands of a resentful Senate. What finally broke the deadlock between the two houses was the appointment of a conference committee packed with moderates to settle their differences. The committee proposed, as the first indispensable step to a solution, the complete separation of Maine's future from that of Missouri. The minute the House members reported that decision, the atmosphere in the House changed and Congress took up the rest of the proposed compromise. But the issue still stood in the way. The Senate had not responded to the committee proposal by immediately showing its good faith and voting to admit Maine. That meant that the House was still operating under a tacit threat from the Senate. That if the House did not admit Missouri without restriction, the Senate would vote against Maine. For 3 hours, the House debated that specific procedural issue, losing precious time as the deadline for the admission of Maine rolled closer. In the end, the House narrowly decided to proceed with the vote on Missouri, despite protests, and it voted by a mere 3 votes to admit Missouri as a slave state. Observers and participants later said that the vote in favor of Missouri would have been much larger had it not been for the continuing suspicion and resentment over Maine. Revealingly, the House also had to vote on the other half of the proposed compromise, the exclusion of slavery from the remaining sections of the Louisiana Purchase above the 3630 line. The House had absolutely refused to consider this proposal whilst it was packaged with Maine, but the moment it was freed of that encumbrance, the members voted 134 to 42 in favour of 3630. Their enthusiasm at that stage casts a light on just how strongly they felt before that about the bracketing of Maine and Missouri. In these circumstances, the vote to admit Missouri was far from a triumph for the notion of maintaining a sectional balance. Maine was admitted immediately in March 1821, but Missouri statehood had to be referred back for the people of the would-be state to agree on a new state constitution. That constitution included a clause preventing the entry of free blacks into the new state. The House objected and so delayed Missouri statehood until August 1821, so that Missouri was admitted 17 months after Maine. Nor did the crisis establish a pattern for the future. There was some talk at the time of insisting on joint admission for future applicants, but between 1822 and 1844, the only two territories promoted to statehood sort of balanced, but succeeded in different sessions. Arkansas in 1836 and Michigan a year later. In 1845, two slave states were admitted in the same year, Florida and Texas, and no free states were and weren't balanced by free states until Iowa and Wisconsin were admitted in December 1846 and May 1848. From then on, only free states were admitted, with the exception of West Virginia during the Civil War. The balancing of slave and free states in the Senate, I would suggest, is no more than a historical illusion created retrospectively by generalizing the particular sectional sensitivities of the 1820 crisis across the whole antebellum period. If then the balancing of Missouri with Maine doesn't explain the compromise, what does? The most obvious answer is that after weeks of bitter argument and hardening sectional lines in the early months of 1820, on March the 2nd, 3 handfuls of Northerners decided to vote with the South and admit Missouri without any restriction on slavery. Everything depended on these so-called doughfaces and whatever it was that persuaded them to give way to the South. John Randolph, who's normally credited with calling them doughfaces, argued that they were just scared of the South and its threats of civil war. By contrast, President James Monroe claimed they were principled Jeffersonian Republicans committed to preserving the constitutional principles of strict construction and states' rights. Either way, they could be seen as patriots willing to sacrifice their own political futures for the sake of the nation. Some doughfaces were indeed a mix of these things. But it's essential, I think, to understanding the course of the argument over the slavery expansion that led to the Civil War, to realize that some of the doughfaces were also sincere anti-slavery men who thought admitting Missouri as a slave state would help deliver a decisive blow for freedom. From the start of the dispute, a compromise was always within reach. People on both sides believed that the future of the West could be settled by agreeing on a dividing line between slave and free areas, west and north of Missouri. Now, we tend to think of James Talmadge as the key anti-slavery leader because of his amendment, which started the crisis in January 1819, calling as it did for no further introduction of slaves into Missouri and the freeing on their 25th birthday of all slaves subsequently born there. However, Talmadge retired from Congress soon thereafter, and his leadership role was taken over by his friend and fellow New Yorker, John W. Taylor. I must confess, I had the most grim photocopied portrait of John W. Taylor. When Jeff saw it, he was so horrified, he insisted on sending me this rather nicer one, which does indeed look more decorative. Back in February 1819 note, Taylor had proposed in Congress that a dividing line should be drawn at 3630, continuing westward the southern boundary of Missouri. In the next session, in December 1819, Taylor repeated the proposal, which had in view banning slavery north of the line, but he's failed in the House in January 1820, partly because many anti-slavery men looked for total success, including a Missouri set on the path of liberty. Do I automatically take the picture if I'm, well, you have to put me on speaker view, I suppose, which I'm not.
What do you need done?
No, Jeff, I was just wondering what people were seeing on their screens, because I'll go back to my screen.
Just you right now. I think you unshared.
It's you, is it? Because that's not what I'm seeing on mine. At this moment, I can only see you, which of course is fine. Surprisingly, however, many Southern congressmen supported the idea of a prohibition on the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. After all, the whole of the South, what the whole of the South wanted was to protect slavery in Missouri and prevent Congress from ever interfering with the state's right to choose slavery for itself. After all, if a state couldn't make that choice at the moment it became a state, when could it choose? But many Southerners accepted the constitutional difference between a state and a territory and believed the federal legislature could make decisions on slavery. For many in the older seaboard slave states, that view was anathema. In Virginia, which in 1820 held 1/3 of the nation's slaves, political leaders were firm that the federal government must be prevented from ruling on slavery at all times and in all situations. But in the old Southwest, newer slave states were more relaxed, mainly because they had good experiences of federal government during the recent years of intense war against the Indians. And their more favorable view of national power found support in the border states and among South Carolina nationalists. As a result, when Senator Thomas of Illinois formally proposed that Congress ban slavery in the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630, a combination of Northern senators and a decent number of Southerners pushed it through the Senate in February 1820. That proposal met with absolute hostility in the House, even though it had originally been a Northern proposal. One reason, of course, was Maine, but the other was a growing intransigence and moral commitment of anti-slavery opinion, as the issue was agitated in the states and counties of the North. When the old Federalist Ruford King had first spoken on Missouri in early 1819, he emphasized the political danger of allowing slave interests to increase their power in Congress. When newly re-elected, he returned to the subject in two speeches in February 1820. He delivered the most crushing moral condemnation of slavery yet uttered on the floor of Congress. King infused an element of religious conviction and moral absolutism into the controversy that had not been there before. In response, Southern threats reached new heights, and the House began to express a sort of anti-slavery that was unwilling to consider the concession of immutable principles. Indeed, many Northerners now argued not only against the admission of Missouri, but also against being tempted by the seductive temptations of the Thomas Proviso, the 3630 prohibition. Some argued that the upper West was a barren prairie resembling the steppes of Tartary without wood or water. In any case, the land wasn't worth having, others said, because the prohibition would prove meaningless. The land there was still owned by the native tribes, and any treaties signed for its transfer could be blocked in the Senate by Southern votes. Moreover, the 3630 proposal assumes that rules governing the territorial stage would determine what happened when an area maturing to statehood, what happened when an area matured to statehood, an assumption that was currently being challenged by Illinoisans. Even though the proposed proviso specifically banned slavery in the new Northwest forever, even moderate Southerners acknowledged that the South would probably attempt to reverse that whenever an appropriate territory applied for statehood. So what was the point of the 3630 prohibition? As a result, Northern congressmen saw that their political futures depended on satisfying the increasingly determined anti-slavery outlook of their constituents, and they worked in the House to produce a version of the Missouri Bill that restricted slavery as far as possible. The House adopted once more the full Talmadge amendment of the year before with a significant alteration. Like Talmadge, it both banned the introduction of more slaves into Missouri and mandated the freeing of the children of slaves born after the passage of the Act. But whereas Talmadge had delayed the emancipation of the newborn until they were 25 years old, the new bill freed them at birth. With the Senate rejecting all restrictions on Missouri by ever-increasing majorities, a total impasse appeared to have been reached, and yet compromise was at hand. On Tuesday, February the 29th, the two houses agreed to appoint a conference committee. The very next day, Wednesday the 1st, the House passed its Missouri bill, complete with the provision emancipating future slave children at birth. It did so by a margin of 11 votes. The very next day, the 2nd, The conference committee reported its proposals to the two houses, and the House, before the day was out, had accepted them all, including the admission of Missouri without any restriction on slavery. I've already suggested the vote in favor would have been larger had it not been for the tacit threat of a Southern veto on Maine. But even the margin of 3 votes was enough to produce an astounding reversal. In effect, in a mere 24 hours, the balance of power in the House had shifted. For 2 years, Northern anti-slavery forces had enjoyed a 10-vote majority. Then suddenly on March the 2nd, it voted 90 to 87 in favor of the new state. Why? Well, the answer is obvious, that 14 Northern congressmen voted with the South and 4 others absented themselves from the vote. Immediately afterwards, firm Northern anti-slavery men condemned the doughfaces as cowardly tools of the slave interest. And this was so widely accepted in the North that the doughfaces had a hard time winning re-election in the upcoming congressional elections. But what distinguished these 18 doughfaces? That they chose the route of political suicide. Some historians have pointed to the fact they were all Democratic Republicans. Others have pointed to the fact that most of them were protectionists. But all such attempts to find common characteristics among the doughfaces miss an important point. Most of the 18 had been voting consistently with the South from the early days of the crisis without affecting Northern control of the House. You now have a more pleasant face to contemplate. But one which is refusing to move. Here we have 10 of the 14 Northern congressmen who voted to admit Missouri. 7 of them had voted a consistent pro-slavery line in both the previous session and so far in this one. Just Henry Baldwin had blotted his copybook by some absences. They had been joined by 3 new members in December 1819 who voted consistently the pro-slavery line through 1820. The fact is that some of these doughfaces had been doughfaces long before the term was applied to them. Back in January 1818, before Missouri applied for statehood, Congress had argued fiercely over a Southern attempt to secure a more effective fugitive slave law. In the House back then, 5 of the 14 Northern congressmen, who 2 years later voted to admit Missouri, had voted with the South in favor of strengthening slave owners' ability to retrieve runaway slaves. A year later, in February 1819, in the first debates over Missouri's admission, 7 of them had voted against the Talmadge Amendment and in favor of allowing slavery in the new Arkansas Territory. In other words, these men had always counted as a fixed part of the pro-slavery minority in the House, and they were now reinforced by 3 more. The vote of these 10 to admit a slave Missouri is therefore no surprise. To reverse the regular anti-Missouri majority, they had to be joined by yet others who had not only been counted as firm members of the anti-Missouri majority, but had voted for the previous day's hardline anti-slavery bill with its extraordinarily generous emancipation of the post-Nazi at birth. In fact, 4 such anti-slavery men joined them, while 4 like-minded representatives somehow managed to miss the vote. What can explain this critical shift by a handful of men who were otherwise regarded as committed opponents of slavery? Clearly, the last-minute doughfaces cannot be accused of being apologists for slavery, but then neither can some of those who've been doughfaces for a long time. Of course, all the doughfaces were tempted to say how much they hated slavery in an attempt to save themselves from their constituents' wrath, though it rarely saved them from defeat in the 1820 election. But even so, there can be little doubt of the anti-slavery commitment of some of these men. Joseph Bloomfield had long been president of the New Jersey Abolition Society. Samuel Foote of Connecticut insisted that, and I quote, "No man detests slavery more than I do. No gentleman would go further to prevent the expansion of the evil if I could believe Congress possesses the power." This sort of constitutional concern on the part of some of the northern anti-slavery men was, of course, exactly the sort of cautious thinking that the empire of slavery relied on to maintain its national political position. But that does not necessarily contradict the sincerity of the anti-slavery sentiment. One striking example is Henry Storrs of New York, the sole self-proclaimed Federalist among the doughfaces, a man who expressed his determination to advance the cause of human liberty in his many speeches, initiatives, and votes in the House. Throughout the Missouri debate, as he said later, the prohibition and extinction of slavery as a moral and political curse to any nation was the chief object to be attained. But Storrs was also convinced that Congress lacked the constitutional power to impose restrictions on a new state. He feared disunion, and he steadfastly voted for the unrestricted admission of Missouri. Like Samuel Foote, who I've lost, like Samuel Foote, he had persistently brought up the 3630 proposal, even in the face of almost solid hostility in the House. Though he throughout had made no secret of his voting intentions, Storrs recognized that he would face political punishment at the polls in 1820. But what incensed him was not the loss of his seat, but the atrocious calumny, in his words, voiced during the 1820 election, that he was the friend and or advocate of slavery, instead of one of its most active opponents in the House. What a long-term I'm becoming alarmed by the time, Jeff. Do chase me.
You're still in bounds.
I'm okay. Yeah, but I can see how much more there is. What a long-term anti-slavery doughface like Storrs shared with those who turned doughface at the last minute was a determination to secure a victory over slavery greater than its mere exclusion from Missouri. At the beginning of the 1820 session, a broad swathe of anti-slavery men had hoped to acquire the whole of the Louisiana Purchase for freedom with the exception of Louisiana itself and possibly Arkansas. But they quickly realized that gains were unlikely given the South's intransigence. Yet they saw that this crisis created an opportunity that might never come again to persuade the South to concede land for freedom. This was just the moment when the South's desperation to secure a slave Missouri gave the North the political leverage to secure the prohibition of slavery throughout the major part of the Louisiana Purchase. Indeed, they thought that this was the best way to restrict slavery's growth. For suppose Congress passed Missouri admission with restrictions on slavery, how could they oblige Missouri to accept its terms? Would they, as Southerners repeatedly ask, use force? If so, where would they find the men? From the South and West? Think again. Northerners may have dismissed as incredible Missouri's threat to leave the Union and become an independent state, given its landlocked position and dependence on outside markets and supplies, but some feared it might become a magnet for migrants and states that were unhappy within the Union. Or Missouri could simply walk away from statehood, as Iowa would do much later, until its population grew to a size that could not be ignored. Or it could enact a state constitution, declare itself a state, and await acceptance by Washington. If any of those things happened, the North would no longer have leverage over slavery anywhere in the West. Far better to accept 3630 now, while the offer was on the table. As Henry Storr said, in retrospect, to have sacrificed to slavery the whole country covered by this restriction, when it was impractical to have accomplished a more extensive prohibition, would have been wantonly to have sported with the most sacred obligations of moral duty and patriotism. To have rejected this restriction, even limited as it was, would have fixed a deep and odious stigma on the character of the country. Sorry. Now, anti-slavery men in the Senate who favored compromise were in the happy position of being able to vote their principles, vote against Missouri, happily knowing that admission of Missouri would pass the Senate anyway. Northern representatives in the House were placed in a very different position. Public opinion had made the issue of slavery in Missouri the touchstone of political soundness, and Lord help any congressman who voted in favor. By the end of January, according to well-informed observers in the North, it would be political suicide for any free state representative to vote to tolerate slavery beyond its present limit. Yet someone had to vote with the South in order to achieve a moral anti-slavery triumph comparable with Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, and to do so while trusting in the Senate's good faith over Maine. A key figure was Charles Kinsey of New Jersey. Back in 1819, he'd voted to impose the Talmadge Amendment in Missouri, but not Arkansas. In 1820, up to and including March the 1st, he likewise voted solidly for the House's full Missouri anti-slavery Missouri bill. Then on March the 2nd, he reversed himself and voted to admit Missouri without restriction, the only congressman who voted for the Talmadge Amendment in 1819 and for a slave Missouri the year later. Speaking as a House member of the Conference Committee, he argued for peace, for the restoration of normal political conditions to help people escape from their current economic plight. But he also argued that the North could now secure a great victory because our Southern brethren have agreed to fix an irrevocable boundary beyond which slavery shall never pass, and in so doing had conceded 9/10 of the Louisiana Purchase to freedom. He felt the compromise had to be seized for the sake of union, even though my constituents may differ with me in opinion. Along with New Jersey's other Dauphises, he was refused renomination in 1820 by the State Democratic Nominating Convention, and his political career ceased, at least for the time being. Similarly, Samuel Eddy of Rhode Island showed his anti-slavery convictions, voting steadily for Taylor's full bill, but then he too flipped and voted for Missouri on March the 2nd. He then spent months defending himself from attacks back home in Rhode Island from those trying to unseat him. Eddy insisted vigorously through the press that his views of slavery are not at all altered, either morally or politically considered. Neither do I question the right of Congress to impose conditions on the admission of new states from acquired territory. But he insisted that the compromise on offer would restrict, not extend slavery. If the Senate was determined not to accept Maine or Missouri with a restriction on slavery, what then was the best course to be pursued to effect the object of a mere abolition man? Before the compromise, he insisted, slavery was permitted in all the territory of the United States west of the Mississippi. To refuse the compromise, therefore, was to permit slavery still to continue in all this territory. It was to lose all and gain nothing. To accept the compromise was to limit it to the new state of Missouri and the territory south of 3630. The territory, therefore, within which slavery is permitted is a small space compared with the whole territory from which it is excluded. Considering the prohibition of slavery as the only object, I insist that the compromise is effected more than could have been effected in any other way. The four turncoats of March 1820 did not stand alone. There were also the four who critically simply missed the vote. Two of them were New York Democratic Republicans. Tompkins was the brother of the vice president. Peck was a man who apparently suffered from severe ill health, but he was a repeated absentee throughout the session, whilst Henry Edwards hadn't eaten all day, had had no lunch, and chose the wrong moment to nip out to get something to eat, during which time the vote was taken. Remarkably, that excuse was accepted back home by both his party and his constituents, and so he won re-election. But there were also the indications that there was more support for the compromise in the House than the narrow margin suggests. I've already mentioned the main issue. But then there's the fact that after the House had approved the compromise, the egregious Virginian John Randolph tried to have the vote reconsidered in order to flush out the four who'd skipped the vote. After much parliamentary manoeuvring, the House refused Randolph's motion by a large margin that suggested some Northern members were either pleased that a measure they had voted against had passed, or were so relieved by the settlement that they were unwilling to reverse it. Randolph was probably right when he claimed that had the South wanted 3 more votes on the critical ballot, they could have had them, and if necessary, 3 more after that. This was at the moment when he described them as dough-faces, terrified by the prospect of Southern resistance and the breakup of the Union. But the real probability is that if other Northern congressmen hadn't been so frightened of their own constituents, the number of anti-slavery dough-faces would have been far, far larger. Certainly, many Northerners recognized that the compromise was not a total loss. Congressman William Plumer of New Hampshire damned the dough-faces' treachery, but then added, "Though we have lost Missouri, we have imposed a restriction on the territories, and this, in my opinion, is a great point gained. It is worth more than all the trouble it has cost us, the time we have spent, and the unkind feelings which have been exciting." And as John Taylor himself wrote to his wife, "We have gained all that was possible, if not all that was desired." Like the Compromise of 1850, the Compromise of 1820 did not pass Congress as a coherent totality. It passed as 3 separate measures and as an agreement between different groups of Southern and Northern members. Even so, almost immediately, some commentators insisted that the outcome must be regarded as a sectional compact to be revered as much of the Constitution itself. After 30 years, according to Stephen Douglas, no less, in 1849, the Compromise came to be canonized in the hearts of the American people as a sacred thing which no ruthless hand would ever be reckless enough to disturb, if only. And why was it so regarded, at least in the North? Because the Compromise had given to the North an immense region occupying the very heart of the North American continent and larger than all the existing free states, well watered and fertile. An immense region now for more than 30 years regarded as consecrated to freedom by statute and compact. This immense region, the bill now before the Senate, in flagrant disregard of sound policy and sacred faith, purposes to open to slavery. This was a moral and practical gain more than commensurate with the famous Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The downhill slide that followed after 1846 revealed just what a dangerous hazard the man of 1820 had run and how significant their anti-slavery achievement. It had helped to reverse the tendency since 1783 for westward expansion to benefit mainly the interests of slavery, and it created the prospect of long-term Northern advantage, which forced Southern radicals to pursue Texas and the gains of the Mexican War. It maintained a tradition of hostility to slave expansion that ultimately would drive the South to secession. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, a common opinion was that the South had won. But the significance of the Missouri crisis cannot be understood unless it is recognized that it also amounted to an important victory for the North.
All right, thank you, Don. Everybody can clap now.
Well, if I clap, I will hear myself.
Yeah, thank you, and that was you know, if it was we were having class, that would have been right on time. So at least in terms of the American class period. So no worries. All right. Well, so now, okay. First of all, I wasn't able to. I kept dying to just. I don't think the setting that lets us share pictures is on. So I got to show the dough faces here. Okay. There you go. Actual dough faces, and people need to start submitting questions. But I guess I'll start, which is so Don. I mean, you know, you accept your argument is very compelling to me. But then you run into the problem of why did dough face become such a dirty word? It seemed that it was not something you could run around with, a label that you could run around with in the North for, you know, it went and it waxed and waned, but you know, even back in the 1820s, that was not a reputation that you wanted to have around yourself. So why was it so hard for? Why was it so hard? Well, why was that? Is that not true, or why? Or if it is true, then why did Northerners have such a hard time seeing the triumph that you're describing?
I think simply that Northern anti-slavery sentiment had so invested in the principle that there must be. Sorry, I have been distracted by emails. So committed itself to the notion there must be no expansion whatsoever, that even just voting for Missouri was seen as the essential touchstone of loyalty to the cause. That's how it was in the crisis. That carried on. And after all, most of the dough faces had been consistent voters with slavery. In other words, I take your question to actually underline my point. The North was very anti-slavery.
Right. No, exactly. Exactly. It's just kind of striking that they won the victory. And well, so does then would you connect this to any larger tendency? Is there some? I mean, a couple of things the Henry Storrs and was it Charles Kinsey's remarks?
Yeah.
You almost wanted to, if you were like sort of a person prone to cosmic back to front, you know, beginning to end of American history generalizations, like some people. I won't, you know, some people I won't name. You might start to think, is there some kind of centrist tendency or some kind of tension, maybe even in the Democratic/Republican Party between the sort of centrist element who really hates radicalism of all kinds, and you know, the sort of hostility that they almost sound like they're condemning AOC. You know, they sound like Nancy Pelosi, like denouncing AOC.
Well, I mean, one could obviously read it that way. I just read it that it's not that they're unwilling to take radical stands, because people were taking radical stands, but they were unwilling to push their radicalism to the extent of disrupting the Union. And my criticism of the paper would partly be that it underplays the sheer force of unionism.
Your criticism of your own paper?
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Okay, well, you ask yourself questions. Actually, let's get some questions from the floor here. Okay.
There's one coming up.
Yep, Edward Charnley. First question.
But what is he wondering, I wonder?
I wonder what he's wondering.
Oh, should I? Oh, okay.
Yeah, bring yourself up. Yes, sorry, I forgot. You better bring yourself up.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Ratcliffe, Edward Charnley, City University of New York History, PhD department. I was wondering, and I've suddenly got powerful stage fright. I was wondering, if you could expand on you talked a little bit about the end of attitudes towards the Missouri Compromise and how it becomes sort of enshrined as this sort of lodestone of compromise, of success. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand on those thoughts a little bit in regard to changing attitudes between 1820 and 1860. I've been looking at the secession crisis and the failure of the Crittenden Compromise and the efforts by Republicans like Thurlow Weed, who pushes for reinstituting this compromise. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts quickly on why that failed or why it became unsuccessful.
Well, at that point, because it's far too late, because by 1861 people have taken such entrenched positions that no compromise had the slightest possible chance. I'm not sure about Thurlow Weed. My understanding was that there was only one Republican editor who backed the Crittenden Compromise, and he had wanted to make the drawing of the 3630 line around the world not mandatory, not saying that slavery had to go south of the line, but that it could be permissible, and that even he was read out of the party for making any concession at all. No Republican was willing to vote for anything that advanced, that extended slavery at all. And indeed, a majority of the northern population had not been willing to vote for it ever since the Wilmot Proviso of 1846. They just tried to kid themselves that there were ways around it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was just an opinionated answer. Yeah.
All right, we have one other question. Do you want to come on?
Yes.
Bring yourself up. There we go.
Thank you, Professor Pashley. Professor Ratcliffe,
Hi.
thank you for joining us today. I really enjoyed the presentation. So I'm a grad student from the City University of New York, and my question is about the, you mentioned briefly the admission of Illinois, and you mentioned that around that time, Southerners had anticipated that the ban stipulated by the Northwest Ordinance would get reversed. And so I have a couple of questions related to that. The first one being, did they anticipate the reversal to come before or after Illinois attains statehood? Did they express these views, outside of Congress in places like state legislatures or in settler petitions? Yeah, so those are my questions.
Okay. Well, I would say, well, I wouldn't say it was all Southerners were thinking of this. There was a vested interest within Illinois, mainly from settlers from Virginia, in favor of doing this, and they had their sympathizers outside. What's quite clear was that they anticipated doing it after they became a state, because they accepted that the Northwest Ordinance ruled whilst they were a territory. What they wanted was statehood, and then in due course, a state convention to revise the state constitution so as to allow it. And famously, they had that referendum in 1824, where it was drastically voted down. Amazingly, 80% of the adult white males in Illinois voted, and 57% of them voted against slavery. There was another part of your question.
Actually, if I could ask a quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
I like how you mentioned that, Virginia settlers go to the Northwest, settle parts of the Northwest Territory and try their best to circumvent or to reverse this policy. If that is so, because, Virginians go everywhere, how come Southerners don't see a reversal coming earlier, as in when Ohio and Indiana, so these are states being admitted earlier, if Virginians go everywhere, why don't Southerners anticipate a reversal coming faster?
I think you're overgeneralizing it. It's not Southerners as Southerners who want slavery. There's a very nice old piece of work on Ohio which demonstrates that most Southerners who migrated to Ohio before 1830 were absolutely committed against slavery. They were leaving Virginia to get rid of the damn thing. Okay? The people in Illinois, and clearly that applied to Illinois as well, as the referendum showed. The people who were interested in introducing slavery into Illinois were upper class Virginians who themselves had slaves, who had a vested interest. It was a peculiar group of people of considerable political influence within the territory.
So these are the Harrisons of the worlds, right?
The Garrisons.
No, Harrison.
Harrisons. Well, Harrison's a good example to take at that point in his career. Certainly.
God.
And of course, Harrison goes down to defeat in the Indiana Territory.
Of course. And just thank you so much for making that distinction that, of the folks who move out of Virginia and into the parts of the Northwest Territory, not to get them all mixed up. So thank you so much.
No, you're most welcome. And thank you for being here. Yes.
Bill Thompson. Bill Thompson had a question. Bill, come on up.
Yeah, I'll get there. You get well, I should be. Yeah, there I am. Given that the Northwest Territories banned slavery, why was there a thought that other territories would be treated differently? And if that was a thought, why did anyone think that the Missouri Compromise settled anything? Are we
You've lost
frozen?
me on that. If the Northwest Territories.
The Northwest Territories banned slavery.
No,
so why
Congress banned slavery in the Northwest
Right.
Territory.
Right. So why didn't that thought carry over to all the other territories that might come into play? And if it didn't do that, then why would anyone think that this question was ever settled so that you would get no credit for having limited slavery by adopting the Missouri Compromise?
Well, what happens is that each area is treated differently. The Northwest Ordinance applied to the Northwest Territory, and it did not in itself establish a precedent for anywhere else. And once you moved west of the river, everything was up for grabs.
But that's my question. Why did they think it was up for grabs? I realize it's not legally binding, but why didn't the thought carry over? That we've established.
But are you saying that congressional law makes no difference?
No. What I'm saying is you've established the precedent that you're not going to allow slavery in territories. Why did that political thought not carry on?
Because you haven't established that it applies to territories. You've only established it for certain specific ones. And it operated there. Clause 6 of the Northwest Ordinance did in fact find fulfillment. So there was therefore every reason to believe that if Congress passed a law banning slavery north of 3630, that too would be honored in future, because as Peter Onoff, I remember arguing in one book, very quickly it was accepted as a compact that was being made between Congress and the people who went out to settle congressional lands, that they in fact had been promised that slavery would not be established there. And so an ordinance which on the face of it applied only during the territorial period had a binding force thereafter. Plus the simple practical fact that the people who'd gone there expecting it to be free of slaves wanted it to remain free of slaves and were determined to see it through. I think it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Okay.
All right. So last week's speaker, Kate Major, had a question, and I'm sorry I didn't see that, the raised hand thing. I'm not used to. Usually people so I apologize if I didn't see that. But Kate, please bring yourself up.
Thank you. We're used to all different kinds of signaling of
I know we are. Yes.
fundraising and stuff like that. So, well, thanks so much for this really interesting talk and all of your work on this period. I wanted to ask a question that actually kind of came up in my talk last week, and that I've thought a lot about as somebody who has done more work on Reconstruction than the Missouri Crisis era. And that is the question which you talked about briefly, but wasn't the point of your paper, which is this discussion in Congress about the extent to which Congress gets to tell the states what kind of constitution they can have, right? So the more like general question about how much regulatory power Congress has over the states as they, at the moment that they enter, because in the antebellum period, it also turns out, like in the case of Missouri, that Missouri comes in under certain conditions, and then they later violate the conditions under which they were brought into the Union. And clearly states can do a whole lot of things as states that they couldn't have necessarily, well, we don't know, that they probably couldn't have done as they were coming in, as they were making the transition from territory to statehood. And this comes up repeatedly during Reconstruction, right? So it's often made me wonder, as I learn more about the Missouri Compromise, the extent to which some of these debates about the terms, the extent to which Congress can dictate terms, are actually sort of previews of Reconstruction. Many times states come into the Union without conflict over this question, but then sometimes the conflict arises and there's really serious consideration. That's probably not merely rhetorical. I mean, maybe you could argue that it was, but so I guess I just wonder what you think about that, and whether you think that's an interesting kind of question that runs through more of 19th century US history than we might think.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting question. I mean, my own feeling is that the returning states during Reconstruction were not territories, and that the territorial precedents do not apply to them. Reconstruction is sui generis, and people have to work it out. But that's my tuppence on that for what it's worth. The major question: can Congress, at the moment a state is becoming a state, impose restrictions on it? And the answer, quite clear in the literature of 1820, is that, well, it always has done. For example, in 1820, one thing which Congress did was what it had done with every other state. It determined the boundaries of the state. And in fact, Missouri was cut down considerably from having been, the initial draft. It was much bigger than Virginia, the Virginia, antebellum Virginia, and its boundaries were much reduced. At this moment, I cannot myself immediately think, yes, another one. In many states, Congress imposed a provision saying that any public lands belonging to the United States must be free from state taxation for 5 years after they were sold into private hands. Now, this is coming pretty close to legislating for the state through the terms of admission. So I think that from that point of view, that there was good reason for saying, states are not exempt from being in some way regulated at the moment they're admitted to the Union.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, you know, the question of whether the seceded states, states that had declared themselves out of the Union were territories or not was obviously debated during Reconstruction, but regardless of whether they were officially considered territories or not, still the question was the extent to which Congress could tell them what to do when it was figuring out how to kind of reunite the nation, right?
Sure.
So, but yeah, it's helpful to think about other less controversial areas in which Congress really does, you know, determine the terms. But anyway, thank you for that.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we finally got a Mizzou student ask a question, and then I think we're going to have to keep in mind the fact that it's like 11 o'clock at night where Don is. Though,
Well,
you know,
not yet. There's another 5 minutes.
there's another 5 minutes, just right. And everyone, by the way, this, you know, Don is a brewery historian, and this colloquium is usually sponsored by a brewery. So don't, you know, if you have if you have something, you don't have to worry about it. You know, it's not on network television. But we have a question from Claire Snert.
Hi, I'm one of the Mizzou grad students. My name is Claire, and thank you first of all for being here with us, especially on a Friday night. We really appreciate it. But I was wondering if you could elaborate on how this period impacted electoral outcomes and electoral politics in 1824.
Sorry to laugh. Right, let me be serious. Yeah, quite simply that not right across the board, but for important constituencies in important places, it did create a very polarized and sectionalized viewpoint. It was quite clear, above all in areas settled by New Englanders, and that's areas to the west as well as New England itself, that what they above all wanted was a non-slave holding president. And there was only one candidate who fitted the bill. And guess what? He got almost all their votes. In the southeast, in Virginia, in the seaboard, in the very area which had been most unhappy about the 3630 restriction, there was a feeling that the whole of the federal government had to be called back to original principles of limited power, and that therefore it was necessary to find some man of principle who would revert to Mr. Jefferson's original principles. And they picked William Harris Crawford as their candidate, a Virginian. It then gets a mite messy when you move out from that, but those are the two blocks one can point to. In the end, I think it's fair to say that probably a majority of voters decided that there were other issues at stake of more immediate concern by 1824, and that the Missouri crisis was in the past and was nothing more than a bad memory. Okay.
So it's a highly influential but not determinative, or it's.
I think that puts it very well.
Oh well, okay. That's our job.
Well,
go ahead.
To reduce my whole book to 3 words.
No. I would. I know that's. I wouldn't do that. That's why you were laughing. It's like she just like said, you know, Professor Ratcliffe, do your whole book. Do your whole book now. But that's great. Thank you, Claire. That's actually a good kind of question.
A good question.
Remember that discount quote. If there's no one else that has a question that wants to break in, it's free time. Otherwise, Jay Sexton had asked to come on at the end and say, of course, he can come on anytime, but he asked to say a few words at the end, or old hooky, as he's calling himself now.
I'm glad that Don laughed at that. For those of you who do not know, Jeff mentioned it. Don is the official brewery historian of Hook Norton Brewery. And I got to tell you, I brought my little card of it. Okay. It's my favorite beer, Old Hooky. And I've had many Old Hookies with Don over the years. And I just want to give a little toast here. I'm so sick of this Zoom rubbish that we don't get to do this stuff in person, but this one feels a little more informal, a little more relaxed. I want to give a little toast to our speaker, to Don. I want to say 3 things about the paper tonight. And then this will just sort of morph into the way these things kind of evolve into a sort of, in the hallway type things, I think what we called it last week. So
Yes.
people stick on or they can go away. But here's the point. So Don, I'll stop rambling. I'll get to the point. It's late for you. You probably missed last call at the brewery. But hear me out. First point I've learned from you: never ever accept conventional wisdom as a given. And this paper was just a classic example of that. I think about your essay on the nullification crisis, okay, which does something very similar. I still think that's the best essay on the nullification crisis. And in particular, if anyone doesn't place Ohio at the center of the early republic, you're always there. And I was waiting for Ohio to come up today. It didn't kind of come up until Sam P. Chase at the end there. But Ohio finally made its way into the paper today. Second point. Now, this one I love. This one people won't know unless they've seen Don in action, particularly, and I've seen this one at job interviews. I'm interviewing candidates. If a candidate or a speaker at a seminar uses a handout, okay, or a PowerPoint or something like that, Don loves to look at it. He loves to look at it and find some kind of incongruity. And before he asks the devastating question, he always says, well, since you gave us a handout, I was looking really closely at it and I found this incongruity. So I was looking at, you had the PowerPoint going on and I was trying to look at it real close. I was going to try to trip you up. You even got a good picture of John W. Taylor up there. Maybe that was Jeff's doing, but there was nothing I could say to trip you up on that. But my last point, third and last point, one of the cool things about Don is the sort of historical inquiry as not a solitary enterprise, but as a sort of collective and social one. I think about Don giving all the toasts at the branch meetings over the years. I think about post-seminar discussions. And I just got to say that it's awesome to see you again, Don. And I hope I see some other kind of branch people on here. I hope that you will come to the long overdue, many times rescheduled branch, which is going to happen in about a year from April, early April. We're going to have branch here, and maybe Don, when we're having that hog roast down by the river at the banks of the Boat Hinge, the ancient Missouri shrine, you will give one of your toasts. So anyways, I just wanted to say cheers. I couldn't find Old Hooky, Don. If I could find Speckled Hen, that's the closest thing I could find. So cheers.
I forgot. We looked into getting old hookies. It's like Don and I both looked into like whether you could even have it sent. And apparently not.
Yeah, well, you can, but you have to pay for it.
Well,
can I just apologize? I had thought of actually coming armed with a good bottle of Hook Norton beer, not necessarily Old Hooky. And then I decided that I better make sure that I did not become too inebriated by starting on it too soon. So
well, let's
be awake by the end of the meeting.
Well, here's what we do, Don. We're gonna give you a hand. Thanks to Don Ratcliffe. And then we're going to turn off the recording, and anybody who wants to sit around and talk to Don or each other more, well, we can do that. So.